She wasn't supposed to be there. Not in the rain, and certainly not still wearing her waitress apron. Mascara running. Hands shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone she was clutching like a lifeline. She stood in the back alley of the most exclusive club in the city, in front of the man everyone whispered about in fear. "I didn't know where else to go," Susan sobbed. He's at the house. He hurt my mum." The Korean Mafia boss didn't blink. He didn't even stand up at first. The music inside his private lounge stopped. The men behind him went silent, their hands moving toward their jackets. "Who?" So Kwon asked quietly. And when Susan pointed toward the flickering lights of the South District, he simply adjusted his cufflinks and reached for his keys. Less than 2 minutes later, 3 black SUVs were parked right outside the man's door. And what happened next changed the way the entire neighborhood saw the Ice King forever. Because that night, the villain became the protector. Stay with me until the end, because the truth about what So Kwon discovered behind that door wasn't what anyone expected. Her name was Susan K. Sutton. 32 years old. Working double shifts at a high-end restaurant that served the city's elite, men who spent more on a bottle of wine than Susan made in a month. She was saving every dollar to help her mother, a woman who had worked until her bones ached just to keep their small apartment. Her mum was all she had. The woman who told her, "As long as we have our dignity, Susan, we are the richest people in this city." But that night, dignity didn't matter. Because a local debt collector, a man who thrived on the fear of the neighborhood, showed up at their door. Demanding interest that didn't exist. Demanding respect he hadn't earned. And when Susan's mom tried to explain that they had already paid, he hit her. Hard enough to crack the glass on the hallway photos. Hard enough to make Susan run out the back door and into the night without thinking. And somehow, out of everyone in the city, she didn't run to the police station. She didn't run to the neighbors who were hiding behind locked doors. She ran straight to the one man who had sat at her table every Tuesday for 3 years. The Korean Mafia boss. And that's when everything changed. The high-end atmosphere of the Golden Dragon was a world away from the cracked pavement and flickering streetlights of the South District. Inside these walls, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and aged whiskey, and silence was the most valuable thing on the menu. For 3 years, Susan had mastered the art of being a shadow. She was the one who knew exactly how So Kwon liked his oolong tea. Steeped for precisely 4 minutes, poured into a pre-warmed porcelain cup, served without a single word being exchanged. So Kwon was a man of iron habits and obsidian silence. Every Tuesday at 7 p.m., he occupied the corner booth, a position that allowed him to see every entrance and exit while remaining shielded by the shadows of the architectural woodwork. Most servers trembled when they approached his table, their hands rattling the saucers, but Susan was different. She moved with a rhythmic, quiet dignity that matched his own. She never hovered, never made small talk, and never looked him directly in the eyes unless it was necessary. She respected his silence, and in return, he offered her something rare in a world of demanding millionaires, a terrifying, absolute respect. There was an unspoken language between them. A slight tilt of his head meant he was ready for the check, a momentary pause in his reading meant his glass was low. Once, months ago, a rowdy businessman from out of town had made a crude comment to Susan as she walked past. Before Susan could even process the insult, So Kwon had looked up from his file. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He simply stared at the man with a gaze so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the room. The businessman had gone pale, paid his bill, and fled within minutes. When Susan later placed a fresh pot of tea on So Kwon's table, he offered a single, microscopic nod. It was his way of saying "I see you." Susan didn't just serve him food, she served as the steady pulse of his weekly routine. She was the only person in the city who saw the man behind the Ice King persona, the way he would occasionally stare at the steam rising from his cup with a look of profound, lonely exhaustion. She didn't know the details of his empire, but she knew the weight he carried. To the rest of the world, he was a monster to be avoided. To Susan, he was the only customer who truly saw her as a human being, not just a uniform. It was this fragile, wordless bond that gave her the courage to run to him when the world finally broke her. She knew that while he owed her nothing, the code of the dragon didn't allow for the mistreatment of those under his watch. And for 3 years, Susan had been the one watching over him. While Susan was surrounded by the hushed elegance of the golden dragon, her mother, Mrs. Sutton, lived in a world where the air was heavy with humidity and the constant, thrumming anxiety of survival. Their apartment was a sanctuary of scrubbed floors and faded lace curtains, but over the last month, that peace had been systematically dismantled by a man named Elias Thorne. Elias wasn't a bank official or a legal representative, he was a bottom feeder who bought up difficult debts for pennies and extracted them with interest that defied the laws of mathematics and mercy. He began as a shadow in the hallway, a heavy-set man with a cheap leather jacket and a smile that never reached his eyes. At first, it was just polite reminders pushed through the mail slot. Then came the knocks, heavy, rhythmic thuds that vibrated through the small living room while Mrs. Sutton sat in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs. He knew Susan worked double shifts. He knew exactly when the apartment was most vulnerable, and he chose those moments to strike. The harassment escalated into a psychological war. Elias would stand on the sidewalk for hours, staring up at their third-floor window, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he watched Mrs. Sutton's silhouette through the blinds. He began leaving gifts on the welcome mat, empty casings, torn eviction notices from other buildings, and handwritten notes detailing exactly what happened to people who didn't respect his timeline. Mrs. Sutton, a woman who had spent 40 years facing the world with her head held high, began to shrink. She stopped humming while she cooked. She started locking the door with 3 different bolts, her hands shaking so much she could barely turn the keys. She never told Susan the full extent of it. When Susan came home, exhausted and smelling of expensive sea bass and soy, her mother would simply put a plate of food in front of her and smile a tired, fragile smile. "It's just the neighborhood, baby," she would say. "Things are just a little loud lately." She didn't want to burden the daughter who was already working 16 hours a day to keep them afloat. But Elias Thorne grew impatient. To him, the Suttons weren't people, they were a ledger entry that needed to be closed. He didn't care about the double shifts or the fact that the debt had been paid twice over in predatory fees. He wanted to feel the thrill of total control. He began to whisper threats through the door, vivid, cruel promises of what he would do to the pretty waitress if the money didn't appear. He was a predator who had mistaken Mrs. Sutton's silence for weakness, never realizing that the woman he was terrorizing was the only thing keeping a much larger, much darker world from noticing his existence. He thought he was the most dangerous man in the South District, right up until the moment he raised his hand and broke the one rule that kept him safe. The Tuesday night service at the Golden Dragon was reaching its peak, a choreographed ballet of silent servers and clinking crystal. Susan was moving between tables with her usual grace, her mind focused on the subtle needs of the room, when her pocket vibrated with an unusual persistence. It was a rhythm she recognized. The emergency bypass she had set up for her mother. Retreating into the narrow, dimly lit service corridor, Susan pressed the phone to her ear, expecting a mundane question about dinner or a quick, "I love you." Instead, she heard the sound of splintering wood. The air in the corridor suddenly felt thin. "Mum?" Susan whispered, her voice tight with a sudden, icy dread. There was no verbal answer, only the heavy, muffled thud of a body hitting a wall and the unmistakable, wet sound of a slap. Then came a voice she had heard in her nightmares, the gravelly, arrogant drawl of Elias Thorne. "I told you I was coming back, old woman," he hissed, his words punctuated by the sound of glass shattering on the tile. "You think your silence pays the bills? You think I'm playing games? Susan's knees nearly buckled. She heard her mother let out a sharp, strangled cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain that tore through the phone line and settled in Susan's chest like lead. Please, Elias, her mother gasped, her voice sounding small and fragile, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. My daughter, she has the money, she's at work. I don't want the money Friday, Elias snarled, followed by the terrifying sound of a struggle. I want the respect now. The line erupted into a chaos of crashing furniture and the sharp, rhythmic crack of a hand striking flesh. Susan screamed her mother's name into the receiver, but the only response was the dull thud of the phone hitting the floor, followed by the heavy, retreating footsteps of a man who believed he was king of a very small, very dark mountain. The line didn't disconnect, it stayed open, broadcasting the sound of her mother's labored, hitching sobs into Susan's ear. Susan stood paralyzed in the hallway, the expensive sandalwood scent of the restaurant now smelling like ash. She looked toward the exit, thinking of the police, but she knew the response times in the South District. She knew they would arrive only to file a report on a tragedy that had already ended. She looked back toward the dining room, toward the corner booth where the Ice King sat in his habitual silence. The law was a ghost, but So Kwon was a reality. In that moment, the professional shadow she had maintained for 3 years evaporated. Driven by a primal, desperate necessity, Susan didn't head for the door. She turned and ran straight toward the only man in the city who could move faster than the clock. The heavy silence of the Golden Dragon shattered when Susan stumbled toward the corner booth, her dignity replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. She didn't stop to apologize for the breach of protocol. She didn't wait for a signal. She simply collapsed at the edge of the table, her phone still broadcasting the hollow, echoing sound of her mother's weeping into the expensive air. The 3 businessmen sitting opposite So Kwon froze, their forks halfway to their mouths, looks of annoyance flickering across their faces at the intrusion. But that annoyance evaporated the moment they saw So Kwon's eyes. He didn't look at the businessmen. He looked at the phone clutched in Susan's white-knuckled grip, then up at the streaks of salt and charcoal on her cheeks. He had spent 3 years reading the subtle language of her service, and in her trembling frame, he read a message that required no translation. Without a word, So Kwon placed his linen napkin on the table. It was a slow, deliberate movement that carried the weight of a closing door. Mr. So, we were just discussing the logistics for the harbor project, the lead investor stammered, his voice trailing off as So Kwon stood. The Mafia boss didn't offer a glance or an apology. He didn't acknowledge the millions of dollars currently sitting on the table. To him, the meeting had ceased to exist the second the air in the room changed. He signaled to his lieutenant, Marco, who was already moving toward him with a dark wool overcoat. As So Kwon slid into the coat, his movements remained fluid and terrifyingly calm. He reached out and took the phone from Susan's hand. He listened for exactly 5 seconds, long enough to hear a man's arrogant laughter in the background, and his jaw tightened with a subtle, predatory focus. He handed the phone back to her, his touch uncharacteristically gentle for a man whose hands were built for war. The car is ready, Marco whispered. So Kwon finally looked at Susan. He didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances. He simply waited for her to find her breath. Show me, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Susan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the terror in her chest replaced by a sudden, surging hope. She turned toward the exit, her red apron fluttering like a battle flag. Behind her, the Ice King followed, his stride purposeful and deadly. As they stepped out into the cool night air, So Kwon didn't look back at the restaurant or the life of order he had built. He only looked toward the South District, his voice cutting through the sound of the idling engines. Take me to her house. The transition from the gilded halls of the Golden Dragon to the rain-slicked pavement of the South District was a descent into a different kind of reality. Susan sat in the back of the lead SUV, her small frame swallowed by the deep leather seat, watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon and gray. Beside her, So-kwon remained a statue of composure, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He didn't check his watch or tap his fingers, he simply existed in a state of absolute, focused readiness that made the air inside the vehicle feel heavy, like the moments before a lightning strike. Behind them, two more black SUVs trailed in perfect, predatory formation. They moved through the narrow streets not as a frantic emergency response, but as a deliberate, unstoppable force. This was the display of restrained power that So-kwon had perfected over decades. They didn't use sirens. They didn't need them. Traffic seemed to part instinctively as the convoy approached, drivers catching a glimpse of the tinted glass and the unmistakable authority of the black-on-black vehicles and pulling to the curb in hushed silence. As they crossed the bridge into the South District, the landscape changed. The polished skyscrapers gave way to boarded-up storefronts and flickering neon signs for liquor stores and laundromats. This was the territory where men like Elias Thorne felt like kings, ruling over the vulnerable with petty cruelty. But as the convoy turned onto Susan Street, the atmosphere shifted. Groups of young men on street corners stopped talking, their eyes widening as they recognized the make and model of the lead car. The neighborhood, usually loud with the friction of city life, seemed to hold its breath. Susan watched through the window as they passed the familiar landmarks of her daily struggle. The broken streetlight she avoided every night, the bodega where she bought milk, the playground where the equipment was more rust than metal. Seeing these places through the lens of So-kwon's protection made them look smaller, less threatening. The predator who had invaded her home had no idea that the Ice King was currently cutting through the neighborhood like a blade through silk. The convoy slowed as it approached the end of the block. There was no screeching of tires, only the low, guttural hum of the engines as the three massive vehicles glided to a stop in a perfect line directly in front of Susan's apartment building. The street went dead silent. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly. So-kwon didn't wait for his men to open his door, he stepped out into the damp night air, his tailored suit a sharp, dark contrast against the crumbling brick of the tenement. He looked up at the third-floor window, his expression cold and unreadable, as his men stepped out behind him in synchronized silence. The knock was coming, and for Elias Thorne, the world was about to end. The hallway of the third floor was narrow, smelling of boiled cabbage and damp wood, but as So-kwon stepped onto the landing, the space seemed to contract under the weight of his presence. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace, his polished shoes silent on the worn linoleum. Behind him, Susan followed like a ghost, her hand still pressed over her mouth to stifle a sob, her eyes wide as she watched the back of the man she had served in silence for years. He was no longer a customer, he was a wall of black wool and iron will, standing between her and the nightmare inside. So-kwon stopped in front of apartment 3C. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back at his men, who had fanned out to cover the stairwell in a display of silent, professional geometry. He simply stood there, his back straight, his expression a mask of cold, restrained focus. From inside the apartment, the muffled sound of Elias Thorne's voice could be heard, arrogant and loud, punctuated by the rhythmic, terrifying sound of a hand striking flesh. Susan flinched at every thud, her knees buckling, but the sight of So-kwon's steady hand prevented her from falling. He raised his hand, not into a fist, but with his fingers curled into a deliberate, authoritative knock. 3 sharp, even raps echoed through the hallway. It wasn't the frantic pounding of the police or the desperate scratching of a neighbor, it was a formal announcement of arrival. It was the sound of a debt far larger than money coming due. Inside, the shouting stopped instantly. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. A few seconds later, the heavy footsteps of a man who believed he was the apex predator of this small hallway approached the door. "I told you to get lost." Elias snarled from behind the wood, his voice thick with unearned bravado. He swung the door open, his chest puffed out, ready to intimidate whatever unlucky soul had dared to interrupt him. The transformation was instantaneous. Elias's smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated. He looked at So Kwon, at the sharp, tailored suit, the slick back hair, and the eyes that held the depth of a frozen lake. He looked past him at the blurred figures of the men in the shadows, then down at Susan, who stood trembling behind the Ice King's shoulder. The dynamic was absolute, power stood in front, cold and immovable, while vulnerability stood behind, finally protected. Elias tried to speak, his mouth working like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. He had spent his life bullying people who had no one to call. He had never considered what would happen when the person at the door was the man who owned the city. Justice wasn't coming in a squad car, it was standing on his welcome mat, and it was seconds away. So Kwon didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the cramped entryway, his presence instantly making the apartment feel smaller, as if the very walls were recoiling from his shadow. Behind him, his men flowed into the room with the synchronized, silent precision of a closing trap, fanning out to block every exit. There was no shouting, no dramatic display of weapons, there was only the suffocating weight of absolute authority. Elias Thorne retreated until his back hit the kitchen counter, his face a ghostly shade of gray. He looked at the men in their sharp, dark suits, then back at So Kwon, who was calmly surveying the room. The Mafia boss's eyes moved with clinical detachment, taking in the overturned chair, the shattered remains of a ceramic lamp, and finally, Susan's mother. Mrs. Sutton was huddled on the sofa, her hand pressed to a blooming bruise on her cheek, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ragged, uneven breathing of the bully. Elias tried to find his voice, his hands hovering uselessly in the air. "Look, I didn't know who she was," he stammered, his bravado replaced by a high-pitched desperation. "It was just business. A misunderstanding. I was leaving, I swear." So Kwon didn't acknowledge him. He walked toward the sofa, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the linoleum. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pristine white silk handkerchief, and handed it to Susan. He didn't say a word, but the gesture was a command. Susan hurried to her mother's side, kneeling to press the silk against the bruise, her tears finally falling freely now that she knew the nightmare was over. Only then did So Kwon turn his gaze toward Elias. He didn't move closer. He didn't raise a hand. He simply stood there, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, looking at Elias as if he were a particularly unpleasant stain on the floor. The Ice King didn't need to yell, his silence was a physical weight, a promise of consequences so severe they didn't need to be spoken aloud. The men in the background remained perfectly still, their watchful eyes never leaving the target. To Elias, they looked like statues of the Grim Reaper, waiting for a signal that could come at any moment. He began to shake, a fine tremor starting in his knees and spreading until his whole body was vibrating with the realization of what he had done. He had spent his life hurting people who couldn't fight back, never imagining that he would one day be the one who was truly, utterly powerless. In the quiet of the room, the only thing louder than his heartbeat was the sound of his own world collapsing. So Kwon hadn't uttered a single threat, but as he looked into Elias's eyes, the message was clear, the time for bullying was over, and the time for payment had arrived. So Kwon leaned forward, just enough for the light from the bare kitchen bulb to catch the sharp, cold edge of his eyes. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a small, leather-bound ledger that Elias had dropped on the counter. He flipped through it with the same clinical indifference Susan had seen him use with wine lists at the restaurant. For every name in that book, there was a story of terror similar to the one he had just interrupted. "You trade in fear," So Kwon said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried more weight than a scream. "It is a cheap currency. It requires no skill to collect, and even less to spend." He looked at Elias, who was now visibly trembling, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. You thought this woman was a target because she had no name you recognized. You thought her daughter was just a girl in an apron. So Quan reached out, his movements fluid and precise, and placed a single gold coin on the laminate counter. The metal rang with a clear, haunting tone that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. This coin is worth more than every debt in your book, So Quan whispered. And yet, it cannot buy back the dignity you took from this house tonight. He stepped closer, invading Elias's personal space until the bully had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. The air between them was thick with the scent of sandalwood and the copper tang of Elias's terror. You will take your books, So Quan commanded. You will go to every door in this district, and you will return every cent you have taken in the last month. You will tell them that the debt is settled by the grace of the Golden Dragon. And when you are finished, you will leave this city. If I see your face or hear your name after sunrise, the fear you sold so freely will become the only thing you have left. Elias didn't argue. He didn't try to bargain. The ego that had fueled his cruelty for years had been stripped away, leaving nothing but a hollow, broken man. He snatched the ledger and the coin with shaking hands and stumbled toward the door, nearly falling over his own feet in his haste to escape the cold, focused judgment of the Ice King. As the door clicked shut behind him, the suffocating tension in the room broke. So Quan turned back to Susan and her mother. The predatory mask didn't fully vanish, but the sharpness in his gaze softened into something resembling the silent respect they had shared for 3 years. He didn't ask for a thank you. He didn't expect a payment. He simply stood in the center of the small, wounded apartment, a silent guardian who had proven that even in the darkest corners of the city, there were rules that could not be broken. The price of a tear had been set, and Elias Thorne had paid with everything he was. The morning sun began to creep over the jagged skyline of the South District, but for the first time in years, the light didn't bring the usual weight of exhaustion and dread to the Sutton household. The apartment was still, the air no longer vibrating with the threat of Elias Thorne's heavy footsteps in the hall. Susan sat on the edge of the sofa, watching her mother sleep, a deep, peaceful slumber that had been absent for months. The bruise on Mrs. Sutton's cheek was a fading violet, but the tension that had lived in her shoulders for so long had finally evaporated. So Quan stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the rising dawn. He had stayed through the night, a silent sentinel who required no comfort and offered no complaints. He watched the street below as his men systematically cleared the neighborhood of Thorne's presence, ensuring that every trace of the predator's influence was erased before the city fully woke. When he finally turned away from the glass, his eyes met Susan's. There was no need for the professional mask of the Golden Dragon anymore. This building is no longer under the ledger of men like Thorne, so Quan said, his voice low so as not to wake the sleeping woman. I have acquired the deed. From this moment on, this house is sanctuary. No debt collector, no landlord, and no shadow will cross this threshold without answering to me. He reached into his coat and produced a small, silver key, placing it on the coffee table beside the silk handkerchief he had lent her. It was a gift of absolute safety, a promise that Susan would never have to run through the rain again. Susan looked at the key, then back at the man who had become her mother's savior. For 3 years, she had served him as a stranger, a ghost in a red apron. Now, the distance between the Ice King and the waitress had collapsed. Why? She whispered, the question finally escaping her lips. I am just a waitress, Mr. So. So Quan paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He didn't look back, but his posture softened ever so slightly. In my world, Susan, loyalty is the only currency that doesn't lose its value. You served me with dignity when I was just a man at a table. It is only right that I serve you now that you are family. He stepped out into the hallway, his men falling into step behind him with their usual hushed precision. As the black SUVs pulled away from the curb, the neighborhood watched in a new kind of silence, a silence born of respect rather than fear. Susan returned to the restaurant that evening, but she didn't walk with a bowed head. She moved with the quiet power of a woman who knew she was no longer alone. She was still the best waitress at the Golden Dragon, but she was also something more. She was the protected daughter of the dragon, and in the South District, that meant she was finally free.